Serious? What dark family secret were you let in on once you were old enough? I found out I had a sister who had been given up for adoption. The only reason I found out was the person who informed me no longer felt bound to secrecy after my mom died. And the person who told me had receipts solid enough that I have no reason to doubt them. It also explains why mom freaked out when I told her I'd done a 23andMe test. 23andMe is how my father discovered he had a bonus cousin. Turns out his uncle had a fling before leaving for WWII that resulted in a child he either never told anyone about or didn't even know himself. When my father looked her, the cousin, up, she happened to live in the same city. He and my aunts contacted her and all met up for lunch. Turns out the woman had been searching for years to find her father's side of family. As far as I know, they still keep in touch. My extremely wealthy uncle was going downhill quick with Alzheimer's. Before he was too far gone, he apparently made a deal with my aunt that when things got to the point that they would have to send him to a nursing home, she would heal him instead. He wrote all of this in a letter and gave it to the attorney of their estate. When the time came, I don't know why she chose to shoot him in the back of the head instead of something less violent, but she did. It was a pretty big trial with a fair bit of news coverage, and it really blew up when the lawyer testified and brought forward the letter. My aunt served like 2 years I think and was released on parole. I found out when I was about 32 that apparently in 1973 my dad had a daughter he never knew existed. I found out because he texted that to me while I was working, after finding out about it himself about 1 week earlier. She was in her late 40s by that point, I think. What sort of tragic is all this time we thought I was my dad's only kid, and he always wanted a daughter but never got one due to marriage's ending. He would have ducking loved this girl. His daughter was the result of a one-night stand with a girl he never talked to again, and according to his daughter the mother had a mental breakdown not longer after giving birth and never really had custody of the daughter anyway. Dad never would have had any way to find out. The baby grew up with the mother's parents in another state, and the mother kinda went AWOL. My parents took me to Disneyland for my 7th birthday. I recall landing, going to the park, having a great first day or two. Then my parents had to step out and take a bunch of phone calls. They sounded very stressed. They kept telling me nothing happened and everything was okay. Eventually we flew home, and surprise, took an extra couple days to go to a big water park away from home. I fondly remember this birthday and eventually forgot about any of the weirdness. Maybe 10 years later my parents finally told me what happened. My uncle, my dad's brother, tried to kill himself on my 7th birthday. He shot himself in the stomach with a rifle. He was poor, addicted to drugs, no work, etc. He felt depressed. My dad had a life he always wanted, so tried to kill himself. He ended up living. My parents took me to the water park so that we didn't have to come home to him leaving the hospital. By not telling me, my parents let me keep my birthday as my day, not the day uncle tried to die. Knowing how a 7-year-old's brain works, I probably would have thought I had something to do with it. My older sister is not my full sister, she's my half sister via my mother. My mother was married before and had my sister with her first husband. Her first husband raped my sister from when she was 2 or 3 years old. My mother caught him assaulting my sister, but no one believed her and my sister was, from what I was told, ducked up. My mother divorced him and he tried to get custody of my sister, so she ran away with my sister, even cutting contact with her own family to keep my sister safe. A few years later she met my dad, who unofficially adopted my sister, and they had me. I grew up not knowing because my sister thought I might not love her the same if I knew we had different dads, and I think maybe some part of her wanted to forget her stepdad isn't really her biological dad. The only reason I ever found out when I was 20 is because somehow, my sister's biological grown mother found my mother's address and called. I answered the phone and she mistook me for my sister. That was an interesting phone call and afternoon. My mother grew up in the American South. Her brother died in his early 20s and she always told me it was a freak accident. A bullet came through the window killing him. They lived in a rural area so I never questioned it. One year, I inherited an old Korean War officer's sword after my grandpa passed. My mom freaked out and told me that it was too dangerous to keep and that we should sell it or get a safe to lock it up in. I thought it was weird so I asked my dad and he got this sad look on his face. Turns out my mom's brother was brutally murdered with a similar sword in the 80s. He had gotten involved with some drug dealers and they thought he had snitched about one of their big deals that got busted. No idea why they decided to use a sword but it was pretty ducked up to hear about. My mom had to ID the body. I found this out when I was 16 but she never directly acknowledged it until years later. My mom said he was just trying to make some extra cash by introducing people who partied to the dealers. I'm about his age now and I can see how he just thought he was making a quick buck. Never thinking something like that would get him killed. Kind of similar story here. I was always told my bio grandpa died in the war. Never ask more about it. Years later when I was 18 or so he came up in a late night drunken convo with my older brother. My bro was saying how he'd love to beat the shit out of our grandpa if he had the chance. I was totally confused. Why would he want to beat up the grandpa we never even met who died in the war? Well, turns out the real story is he was a horrible abusive drunk, used to beat our grandma and mom, aunt and uncles. He'd routinely get so plastered that my grandma had to load her young kids in the car to pick him up from the bar at 2 AM. He was also a womanizer. Apparently he'd been knocking boots with a couple different guys gals around their small town. When word got out the guys followed him out of the local honky tonk and beat him to death with a lead pipe, so the story goes. Then they threw his body in his pickup truck, drove it to a nearby hotel and dumped him in a random room. No charges were ever brought. Everyone involved stayed quiet enough that the law never got involved. Obviously someone blabbed, as we know the story now, but it was essentially chalked up to small town private justice. Then that same night I learned my sweet Betty White style grandma had an affair with a lieutenant general when she was in the Air Force afterwards. Definitely a lot to take in while half in the bag in a hotel room at 2 AM. My uncle didn't die in a car accident. He killed his mistress and then killed himself by crashing his car with her body in the trunk. Dude, here's a family story I refer to as the accident. 4 years my older sister's bio dad died in her accident when she was 8. She didn't find out until she was a teenager that it wasn't a car accident. It was a painted the ceiling with his brain accident. Anyway, fast forward 30 some years and my sister deals with a fuckload of mental issues and is constantly treating her children poorly. It's Easter Sunday and our younger sister is introducing her boyfriend to our family, and it's his first meal with us. Think modern Norman Rockwell style all out meal but with a bunch of kids and family. But my older sister won't stop yelling at her kids. My dad, who has been her only active father, finally snaps and tells her to knock it off. She, a 40-something-year-old woman, pulls the "you're not my dad" line like a shitty teenager. That man goes from calm to red, stood up, veins bulging from his head and absolutely screams, "Yeah. Your ducking child molester dad blew his ducking head off. He never had to deal with your bullshit," and that's how everyone in our family found out what the accident really was and why it happened. Why the neighbors moved, trigger warning for violent crime. I was pretty young when this happened so the details won't be perfect, but the story is otherwise true. I grew up in a coastal town and we had some neighbors whom I really liked. My parents were friends with them. Their kids were roughly my age. Wonderful. We played together all the time. One day they very suddenly moved. I was a bit confused as there had been no clue that they were going. I remember some police cars and the moving vans weeks later, but that was it. My mother told me that the kid's grandmother had become very ill. The cops came to tell the family, and they left emergently to care for her and never came back. I was only about 5. Seemed legit. Many years later, as an adult, and long since moved away from that area, my parents and I were reminiscing over our old home. I mentioned that I wondered whatever happened to them. That's when my mom told me the truth. The parents had gone out that night on a date and left the kids with a 14-year-old babysitter. When they returned home they found the sitter murdered. Someone had broken into the home and then killed the sitter. My mom stated the cops think the sitter pretended to be the only one home to protect the kids. When the parents got home they checked the kids were safe and set them back to sleep. The police obviously immediately came. Once the kids were hard asleep the parents picked them up, put blankets over their heads, asked the cops to be silent as they walked them out, and took them out of the house. They gave the kids the same story my parents told me. Grandma was sick and they were going to live with her. Grandma dutifully played along with the ruse for several weeks until the parents could find a new home to live in. The kids were kept unaware of what had happened just mere feet from them as they didn't want the kids to be forever terrified of it happening again. Not sure if the kids ever eventually figured out the truth of that one. When my grandma's gentleman friend was admitted into a care home for his dementia they had a problem in verifying his medical records. As he deteriorated he lost his Irish accent and would occasionally speak in German. He was a child during WW2. My parents reckon he was probably a Jewish escapee. This happened to my great aunt. She was a German Jew and she got Alzheimer's. She forgot her husband, then forgot she wasn't trying to escape the Nazis, then forgot how to speak English and spoke in German thinking she was a teenager, then forgot how to speak, then died. Alzheimer's is not the best. My dad's side of the family has ties with the mafia. Thankfully my mom has long since divorced my dad and their life a decent distance apart. I heard stories of my mom's parents who lived close by at the time circling the block in their truck late at night soon after the divorce to ensure no one was there to hurt us. I was very young at this point, probably like 3-4, so I really have no memory of this. I do remember one night our garbage can was burned to the ground, and my mom has since told me about death threats soon after the divorce. My mom a couple years ago watched a documentary on prominent mafia families and noted multiple names that were at her wedding. When I turned 21, my grandfather told me a story about his older brother that I had never heard. My great uncle was a big boozer for most of his life. He passed at 92 and by then had switched from liquor to beer and wine. He also cut down to 1 pack of cigarettes a day instead of 2 after he had half a lung removed. Pap and my uncle grew up on a farm in the 30s and 40s. Mostly the family ran the farm by themselves, but from time to time they would hire drifters on as farm hands. In 1950, my uncle and one of the farm hands were out drinking and they were driving back to the farm in my uncle's convertible. My uncle was the one driving and he misjudged a turn that had a steep bank on the right side. He ran the car up the embankment, which was steep enough to flip it. My uncle was thrown from the car, but the farmhand he was drinking with was only halfway out of the car when it landed. Pap said he was severed clean into 2 pieces. Because the farmhand was just a drifter without any family to make much fuss and because the Korean War had just started, my uncle was able to enlist and avoid any criminal charges. He was in Korea until the end of the war. That was the only time I've ever heard that story told, and although I would never be someone who has more than a few drinks before getting behind the wheel, it's something that definitely sticks in my mind. And it's a story I'll tell my own kids when they get their license. My paternal great-grandmother was owned by a wealthy cattle ranch around the turn of the last century on the Mexico-Texas border in the 1890s, 1900s-ish. She didn't leave the ranch until she was 16 when she got pregnant and ran away because the baby belonged to the owner of the ranch and she thought he'd kill her if he found out. It was strange to learn that the old lady that would hold me and sing to me as a kid spent the first decade and a half of her life as property. I wasn't told any of this until after my grandmother, her daughter, passed away. My great-grandmother was very ashamed of her past and I think by extension so was my grandmother. Looking at old photos of my grandmother and her older brother, the baby she had at 16, he does look strikingly more European than my grandmother, an indigenous Mexican. My maternal grandfather was a pedophile and harmed my mother and her siblings. It was a well-known secret in the family, which is even more disgusting. Growing up I used to spend the night at my dad's parents' house all the time, but I don't have a single memory of spending the night at my mom's parents' house. Never once sat on his lap. Never once did my mom ever allow him to hug us. I never understood why my mom was so cold to him when my father was so close with his own father. I grew up resenting my mom for withholding us from a whole other set of grandparents and wished she would have told us sooner than when she finally did. I would have had more sympathy for her. Edit. Grammar. My great-grandmother was shot dead in the street by an ex-boyfriend, in front of my 4-year-old grandma and her 2 younger brothers. It happened in a really quiet European town and I believe it made the papers. Grandma ended up being sent to live with an aunt and the boys stayed with their father and he remarried a nasty abusive woman. I didn't know this until I was 18. From the older boy actually, Uncle Jay. But hearing this story really changed my perspective on Grandma and the boys. The boys both ended up going to prison and having difficult lives, and Grandma was a stern, unemotional woman. I feel like this gave me some understanding as to why. I was told by my aunt, before my parents thought it necessary, that my dad had cheated on my mum and slept with a stripper and that I was her daughter and not actually my mother's. I found out years later that my dad wasn't actually my dad either, though he thought he was, which is why he put his name on my birth certificate and brought me home when my birth mother wanted nothing to do with me. Fun times. Just found this one out recently. My uncle was a doctor working in a small town hospital. He was married and had just had a baby boy. While his wife was pregnant or just had the baby, he had an affair with 2 nurses in the hospital and ended up getting one of the nurses pregnant. When he found out of the second kid, he took his family and ducked off to New Zealand for 3 years. Upon returning to Canada in the same small town hospital, his wife immediately found out about his illegitimate child and divorced him. My illegitimate cousin stopped coming around to family events, and when I talked to him about it last year, he told me that my grandparents always blamed him for ruining my uncle's marriage. Found this out after my grandfather died. Growing up, every older guy in the neighborhood would say how tough he was. I mean, he was the most intimidating man I'd ever met. You would jump if he sneezed. I'm not even exaggerating. But I'd never seen him actually fight. But everyone, and I mean everyone, women and men, would say he never lost a fight and usually never had to throw more than one punch to knock someone out. Simply put, he was a bad motherfucker. But growing up, he would always preach to me and my cousins to never fight if you could help it. Just walk away. If they're insulting you, just walk away. It's only words. Sticks and stones and all that. Head drill it into our heads that you never fight unless you have to, and never under any circumstances do you throw the first punch. Ever. I was kind of confused. Every older person in our neighborhood would tell me how nobody ducked with Blackie because of how many people he knocked out, and he would always tell us not to fight. Turns out when he was in his 20s, he got into a fight with someone. Apparently the guy kept insulting him and wouldn't leave him alone. Finally he had enough and cracked the guy. Knocked him out with one punch. Problem is, when he landed, he hit his head on a step. It was lights out for good. Killed him with one punch. I had never heard this story and confused about how he didn't get locked up. Turns out he did. Got like 15-20 years or something like that. Then WW2 happened. When I was a kid, I'd always ask my mom how my grandfather entered the war. Was he drafted or volunteered? She'd say, oh, it was like the movie The Dirty Dozen. Which I had never seen or had any interest in when I was young, so I had no idea what that meant. Turns out the army made him a deal. Go to the front lines in Japan. If you live well, expunge your record. If not, oh well. He went. Things made a lot more sense after that. A family member walked in on my mother breaking my arm by holding me only by it when I was 2. Didn't say anything for fear of breaking up a family. Mother abused me my whole life, and even after cutting contact 3 years ago is still trying to ruin my life. This family member told me the story casually and acted as if they'd done me a favor because I could have ended up in care. Had to pull back from all of them now because of the realization they were all bystanders and let it go on without a word. This might be a bit too weird for this thread. I am from a country still enshrined in a lot of superstition and religion. My great-great-grandmother was a crazy woman who practiced witchcraft. One day her husband died unnaturally, he was murdered or something by the village, and Granny went mad. She gathered the village folk around and picked up a rock from the ground nearby and declared that the rock will be her curse and the village will suffer for killing her husband. After that she healed herself. For multiple generations my family worshipped the rock as a deity and prayed to lift the curse from the village. It ended when my father in his 20s got sick of his family doing stupid shit. Him and his cousin stole the rock overnight from someone's house and threw it near a railway track. And now I wish I was making this shit up, but my father, uncles and aunts all told me this story when I grew up. My granddad's parents were collaborators in WWII. He was only 6 when the war ended, so he was innocent, but his dad regularly hosted Nazi officers who ran the city where they lived and helped them arrest resistance members. Whilst my grandmother's parents were actually resistance fighters and helped downed British and American pilots escape and hide, as well as provided passports to Jewish people. Kind of a wild story, but that was the state back in the 1940s here. Either you kept your head down and kept a low profile, either you helped the Nazis and profited from the occupation, or you fought them wherever you could. My great-grandparents got drunk and locked 2 of my uncles out of the house late at night in the middle of winter. My great-grandparents wouldn't wake up and my uncles couldn't get in, so they tried to walk to their grandma's house that was like 15 miles away, and one of them froze to death and the other had to have his feet and hands amputated because of frostbite. My great-grandparents lied about what happened and said they snuck out. It was in the newspaper and was made out to be this heartbreaking story about 2 dumb little kids who snuck out in the middle of the night because they wanted to see their grandma. When I was 15-16 my parents got liquored one summer night with a bunch of their friends and I was told the story of how our house was bought from a milliardaire. Dude and his wife lived in the house my parents bought for I think 10 years, maybe less. Whatever triggered him, they didn't know, but he beat her to death with a cast iron pan and strangled her with a belt for good measure. Left the body in the backyard poorly buried. He tried to heal himself by drinking a gallon of WD-40 and drowning himself in a body of water very close to where I live. However, he tried to drown himself when the tide was coming in. Wasn't very successful, and the police found him half dead on the beach the next day after a neighbor got super suspicious about the grave in the backyard, and also all the sketchy noises he heard the night before. I think he got 15 years for it, but I have no idea what his name is. I couldn't pry that part out of my parents, but his name was the last one on the house before my parents bought it when I was 4. My relatives were a wealthy, childless couple in Chicago. Their housekeeper, who had a baby, took ill and was hospitalized. The couple took the baby to California and raised her as their own. This baby, Marie, grew up without siblings, as my grandmother's cousin. Marie discovered the truth as an adult, by accident. Even though this kidnapping happened over 100 years ago, I always wondered what became of that poor woman who was released from the hospital to find her baby had been kidnapped by her employers. I have a set of china dishes from Marie that I use at Thanksgiving, every year. Wild story. My mother got pregnant when she was 17, so her and my dad were going to ask her parents for permission to marry. Instead, they got an ultimatum: get an abortion or be sent away to a home for unwed mothers. My mother got the abortion and married my father 2 weeks after her 18th birthday. She proceeded to have several miscarriages and stillbirths, almost certainly due to the damage done to her uterus cervix. My brother was conceived with medical assistance and I was a lucky surprise. My parents are still married 46 years later. That my family's money originally came from being moonshiners during Prohibition. I grew up in Appalachia. My mom told me about being little and playing in show boxes full of cash. And about sitting in the backseat on late night drives where you could hear the jars rattling in the trunk heading across the Tennessee border. When I was a kid in the mid-80s, my uncle got some serious braces and had to drink liquids only for a while. Only when I got older did I learn that he'd actually had his jaw wired after being tortured for information. Had a gum put in the mouth and eventually his jaw shattered because he wasn't talking. He wasn't talking cause he didn't know anything. Thank God Northern Ireland has moved on from those days.